March 14, 1943. The concrete bunker housing Kriegsmarine Intelligence Section 3B in Berlin trembled slightly as Allied bombers passed overhead, their payloads destined for the city's industrial districts. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Müller hunched over reconnaissance photographs spread across his metal desk, his coffee growing cold as he studied images that would fundamentally alter Germany's understanding of American industrial capacity. The photographs, taken by a Focke-Wulf Condor on a daring surveillance run over the eastern seaboard, showed something that German naval planning had dismissed as impossible. 7 aircraft carriers under simultaneous construction at a single shipyard. Müller had spent 18 months analyzing Allied naval construction as part of the Kriegsmarine's Strategic Assessment Directorate. His reports tracked British carrier losses, estimated American replacement rates, and calculated the timeline required for new warship construction based on German and British precedents. Every analysis had concluded that aircraft carrier production demanded 3 to 4 years per vessel, requiring specialized facilities, skilled labor forces, and material resources that even America's vaunted industrial base could not easily expand. The photographs before him suggested that every assumption underlying German naval strategy was catastrophically wrong. Newport News shipbuilding showed 3 Essex-class carriers in various stages of completion. The Brooklyn Navy Yard revealed 2 more hulls taking shape on adjacent slipways. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard displayed another pair of massive vessels whose distinctive island superstructures identified them unmistakably as fleet carriers, rather than the smaller escort types that intelligence had anticipated. Müller reached for his slide rule, performing calculations that became increasingly desperate, as the mathematics revealed implications he desperately wanted to reject. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 7 carriers under construction simultaneously represented a production rate that exceeded Germany's entire capital ship output since 1933. The Essex-class specifications that intelligence had pieced together from fragmentary sources indicated vessels displacing 27,000 tons, capable of operating 90 aircraft, and designed for sustained operations in the Pacific Theater, where Japanese carrier forces remained Germany's only effective naval ally. Construction of a single such vessel should require 48 months based on German experience building the Graf Zeppelin, their own aborted carrier project that had consumed 6 years and remained incomplete when war began. The reconnaissance photographs showed vessels at varying completion stages, suggesting construction timelines that violated everything. Müller understood about naval architecture and industrial capacity. One carrier at Newport News appeared nearly complete, her flight deck planking visible, and island superstructure topped with radar arrays. Another showed only skeletal framing, her keel laid perhaps 6 months earlier based on construction progress visible in earlier surveillance imagery. The implication was inescapable. American shipyards were completing fleet carriers in 12 to 18 months, a production rate that German industry could not approach, even under optimal conditions that no longer existed in 1943. Müller's analysis section had tracked American naval construction since 1941, when initial intelligence reports suggested accelerated destroyer and escort vessel production. Those early assessments had acknowledged American advantages in raw materials, manufacturing capacity, and workforce size, but had dismissed concerns about strategic implications. Germany's U-boat campaign would interdict Atlantic supply lines, preventing American industrial output from reaching European theaters. Japan's carrier forces would contain American naval power in the Pacific, forcing Washington to divide resources between 2 ocean theaters. The strategy had seemed sound when formulated in 1942, based on assumptions about production limitations that the photographs now revealed as wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment. The Essex-class program represented something unprecedented in naval history, not merely expanded production of existing designs, but systematic application of industrial methods that transformed warship construction from craftsman-based shipbuilding into assembly line manufacturing. Mueller had studied captured American technical manuals that described welding techniques replacing riveted construction, prefabricated hull sections assembled like puzzle pieces, and standardized components manufactured at inland facilities then shipped to coastal yards for final installation. The methods seemed crude compared to traditional European shipbuilding, prioritizing speed and quantity over the refinement that characterized German naval architecture. The results, however, spoke clearly through the reconnaissance imagery. American shipyards were producing fleet carriers faster than U-boats could sink merchantmen, faster than Luftwaffe bombers could destroy industrial facilities, faster than German strategic planning had considered physically possible. Mueller began drafting his assessment report, choosing words carefully to convey urgency without inviting accusations of defeatism that had become dangerous in Berlin's increasingly paranoid military hierarchy. His analysis would need to present facts objectively while acknowledging implications that challenged fundamental assumptions underlying German naval strategy. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, had commissioned in December 1942 after construction lasting just 20 months. Intelligence sources confirmed that USS Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway, had followed 3 months later, with USS Intrepid completing trials in preparation for Pacific deployment. 3 fleet carriers operational within 15 months suggested production capabilities that exceeded even optimistic American projections from 1941. More troubling were the vessels still under construction, representing a building program that showed no signs of slowing despite material demands from simultaneous offensives in North Africa, preparations for European invasion, and expanding Pacific operations. Mueller cross-referenced construction timelines against intelligence reports detailing American shipyard expansions. Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California had added new slipways capable of handling carrier construction. Norfolk Navy Yard in Virginia had expanded facilities to accommodate simultaneous construction of multiple capital ships. The pattern revealed systematic planning that had begun before Pearl Harbor, suggesting American strategic thinking that anticipated prolonged naval warfare requiring sustained production of major combatants. German naval planning, by contrast, had assumed that existing fleet strength supplemented by U-boat construction would prove sufficient for achieving strategic objectives before American industrial mobilization could affect the war's outcome. The assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. By March 1943, American shipyards had launched 8 Essex-class carriers with 16 more under construction at various facilities. Production rates were accelerating rather than plateauing as shipyard workers gained experience, and manufacturing processes became increasingly efficient. Mueller's calculations suggested that American yards would complete 24 fleet carriers by autumn 1944, a force capable of overwhelming Japanese naval aviation while maintaining sufficient strength for Atlantic operations if required. The strategic implications extended beyond simple vessel counts. Each Essex-class carrier operated an air wing of 90 aircraft, including Hellcat fighters, Dauntless dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes, whose performance characteristics matched or exceeded Japanese types. 24 carriers represented over 2,000 carrier-based aircraft, supported by logistics networks that could sustain operations across the Pacific's vast distances. American naval aviation would achieve numerical superiority so overwhelming that Japanese forces, regardless of pilot skill or tactical innovation, could not prevent steady American advances toward Japan's home islands. Mueller understood that his report would reach Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had assumed command of the Kriegsmarine after Erich Raeder's resignation in January. Dönitz remained committed to U-boat warfare as Germany's primary naval strategy, arguing that submarine forces could still achieve decisive results against Allied shipping despite increasing losses to improved anti-submarine tactics. The carrier production data would challenge this optimism by demonstrating that American industrial capacity could replace losses faster than German forces could inflict them, while simultaneously expanding offensive capabilities in both Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The mathematics were merciless. Germany's submarine construction program aimed to complete 30 U-boats monthly, replacing losses and expanding the operational fleet to maintain pressure on Atlantic convoy routes. Each U-boat required approximately 12 months to construct, train crews for, and deploy operationally. American shipyards were completing fleet carriers, vastly more complex vessels requiring sophisticated systems and larger crews, in comparable time frames, while simultaneously producing escort carriers, destroyers, destroyer escorts, and merchantmen in quantities that dwarfed German output across all categories. Müller's analysis included comparative production data that illustrated the disparity with brutal clarity. Germany's total steel production for 1942 had reached 32 million tons, of which naval construction consumed approximately 8%. American steel production for the same period exceeded 86 million tons, with naval allocation exceeding Germany's total output. The United States was constructing warships using material resources that exceeded Germany's entire industrial capacity, while maintaining production of aircraft, tanks, trucks, and munitions that supplied not only American forces but British and Soviet allies through Lend-Lease programs. The implications for Germany's strategic position became inescapable when Müller considered timeline projections. By late 1944, American carrier forces would achieve such overwhelming superiority in the Pacific that Japanese naval aviation would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. American attention would then turn toward Europe, where carrier-based aircraft could support amphibious operations, provide air cover for invasion fleets, and extend American air power to targets beyond the range of land-based bombers. The Kriegsmarine possessed no effective counter to carrier task forces operating in European waters, having abandoned its own carrier program and lacking surface combatants capable of contesting American naval superiority. Müller drafted carefully worded paragraphs that presented these conclusions without explicit acknowledgement of their ultimate meaning. German military culture discouraged defeatist analysis, but operational planning required realistic assessment of enemy capabilities. His report would need to walk a careful line between objective intelligence analysis and the optimistic projections that senior leadership demanded. The photographs provided incontrovertible evidence that American carrier production exceeded all previous estimates, but interpreting their strategic significance would require readers to draw conclusions that Müller could not explicitly state without risking his position or worse. The afternoon stretched into evening as Müller refined his assessment, cross-checking vessel counts against intelligence reports from agents in American ports, aerial reconnaissance data from surviving Condor flights, and fragmentary communications intercepts that provided glimpses of American naval deployments. Each source confirmed the fundamental conclusion. American carrier production represented industrial capacity operating at scales that German planning had not anticipated and could not counter through available means. 24 fleet carriers in 18 months. The number acquired almost talismanic significance as Müller contemplated its implications. Germany had required 6 years to lay down a single carrier that remained incomplete when war began. Britain, with her extensive naval shipbuilding tradition and global empire's resources, had completed 6 fleet carriers during the same period. Japan, whose naval strategy centered on carrier aviation, had commissioned 8 fleet carriers between 1922 and 1941. The United States would exceed the combined carrier construction of all other nations in human history during a single 18-month period, while simultaneously expanding every other category of naval vessel and maintaining production of ground forces equipment at levels that supplied multiple Allied nations. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz received Müller's report on March 18, 1943, in his headquarters at the Hotel Royal in Paris, where he had established command operations after assuming leadership of the Kriegsmarine. The admiral, who had built his reputation commanding U-boat forces and remained convinced that submarine warfare offered Germany's only viable naval strategy, spent 40 minutes reviewing the intelligence assessment before summoning his staff for immediate conference. The photographs and production data challenged assumptions that had guided German naval planning since the war's beginning, requiring re-evaluation of strategic priorities that Dönitz had championed throughout his career. Kapitän zur See Eberhard Gott, Dönitz's chief of staff for U-boat operations, examined the reconnaissance imagery with the methodical attention to detail that had made him invaluable for coordinating submarine deployments across the Atlantic. Gott had supervised the expansion of Germany's submarine fleet from 57 operational boats in September 1939 to over 400 by early 1943, orchestrating Wolfpack tactics that had sunk millions of tons of Allied shipping. His expertise lay in operational coordination rather than strategic assessment, but the carrier production data prompted immediate recognition of its implications for U-boat effectiveness. American escort carriers, smaller vessels designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare, were entering service at rates that threatened to close the mid-Atlantic air gap, where U-boats had previously operated with relative impunity from aerial attack. The Essex-class fleet carriers represented a different challenge entirely. Their operational radius extended American air power across oceanic distances that rendered traditional surface raiders obsolete, while their aircraft capacity enabled sustained operations that could hunt submarine forces with persistence that shore-based aviation could not maintain. Gotti understood that increasing American carrier strength would eventually extend to Atlantic operations, transforming the strategic environment in ways that favored defenders over attackers. Dönitz listened to his staff's analysis with visible frustration, his commitment to U-boat warfare colliding with evidence that American industrial capacity was rendering traditional naval strategy increasingly irrelevant. The Grand Admiral had argued since 1941 that submarine forces could achieve decisive strategic results by interdicting Allied supply lines, preventing American industrial output from reaching European theaters. British imports had declined significantly under U-boat pressure, validating Dönitz's strategic vision and justifying continued emphasis on submarine construction despite mounting losses to improved Allied anti-submarine tactics. The carrier production data suggested that this strategy, however successful tactically, could not achieve strategic victory against an opponent whose industrial base could simultaneously expand offensive capabilities while replacing losses at rates exceeding German capacity to inflict them. Dönitz faced the prospect of reporting to Hitler that the naval war was unwinnable through available means, a conclusion that would invite accusations of defeatism while offering no alternative strategy that Germany's diminished resources could realistically pursue. The meeting extended through the afternoon as staff officers debated the intelligence assessment's implications. Some argued that the reconnaissance photographs might represent deception, showing the same vessels from different angles to exaggerate production rates. Others suggested that American quality might suffer from rapid construction, producing carriers with mechanical problems or design flaws that would limit operational effectiveness. These objections collapsed under scrutiny. Multiple intelligence sources confirmed the vessel counts independently, and captured American technical manuals revealed construction methods that prioritized reliability through standardization rather than accepting quality compromises for speed. Fregattenkapitan Gunther Hessler, Dönitz's son-in-law and a decorated U-boat commander who had transitioned to staff duties, provided the most damaging assessment. Hessler had studied American industrial methods during a pre-war visit to Detroit automobile factories, observing assembly line techniques that produced vehicles at rates European manufacturers could not approach. He recognized similar principles in the carrier construction data. Americans were applying mass production methods to warship construction, treating complex vessels as assemblies of standardized components manufactured at specialized facilities, then integrated at final assembly yards. The approach violated traditional shipbuilding practice, which emphasized custom fitting and craftsman expertise for each vessel. German shipyards built warships as unique creations, with skilled workers hand-fitting components and making continuous refinements throughout construction. The method produced excellent vessels, but required extended timelines and skilled labor forces that could not be rapidly expanded. American yards were building carriers like automobiles, sacrificing refinement for speed and reproducibility, accepting minor variations between vessels in exchange for production rates that overwhelmed opponents through sheer numbers. Hessler's analysis included disturbing details about American shipyard organization. The Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast had reduced Liberty ship construction time from 244 days to 42 days through systematic application of prefabrication, modular assembly, and workforce specialization. Similar methods were being applied to carrier construction, with hull sections fabricated inland, then transported to coastal yards for assembly. Engines, electrical systems, and armament were manufactured as complete units that could be installed rapidly rather than assembled piece by piece aboard ship. The entire process reflected industrial thinking that prioritized throughput over traditional craftsmanship. German naval architecture had always emphasized quality over quantity, producing vessels whose engineering sophistication and combat effectiveness exceeded their displacement tonnage. The battleship Bismarck, pride of the Kriegsmarine before her sinking in May 1941, had incorporated advanced fire control systems, superior armor layouts, and propulsion plants that represented the pinnacle of European naval design. Her construction had required 4 years and consumed resources that might have built dozens of smaller warships. The Americans were building adequate vessels in quantities that rendered individual ship quality strategically irrelevant. Dönitz ordered additional reconnaissance missions to confirm vessel counts and identify other shipyards that might be contributing to carrier production. The results, compiled over subsequent weeks, revealed an even grimmer picture than Muller's initial assessment had suggested. Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard was constructing Baltimore-class heavy cruisers using methods similar to carrier production techniques. West Coast yards were producing destroyers and destroyer escorts in quantities that suggested American escort forces would soon outnumber German submarines. Most troubling were intelligence reports indicating that American production rates were still accelerating as manufacturing processes matured and workforce experience increased. The strategic calculus became inescapable when staff officers projected American carrier strength through 1944 and beyond. If current production rates continued, the United States would operate 40 to 50 fleet carriers by late 1945, supported by similar numbers of escort carriers and protected by destroyer screens that would make coordinated submarine attacks increasingly difficult. This force would achieve such overwhelming superiority in the Pacific that Japanese resistance would collapse, freeing American naval power for redeployment to European waters, where the Kriegsmarine possessed no effective counter to carrier task forces. Miller's follow-up reports detailed the Essex-class design features that made rapid production possible. The carriers utilized a standardized hull form, with minimal variation between vessels, allowing shipyards to develop specialized construction techniques and reuse tooling across multiple ships. Their propulsion plants used commercially derived steam turbines rather than custom naval designs, reducing manufacturing complexity and allowing procurement from multiple suppliers. Electrical systems, damage control equipment, and auxiliary machinery incorporated standardized components that could be mass-produced and stockpiled, eliminating delays from custom fabrication. The contrast with German naval practice was stark. The Graf Zeppelin, Germany's abandoned carrier project, had incorporated custom-designed systems throughout her construction, requiring specialized components that only specific manufacturers could produce. Design changes during construction had necessitated reworking completed sections, extending timelines, and consuming resources without corresponding improvements in combat effectiveness. The project had symbolized German naval architecture's emphasis on perfection over practicality, producing a vessel that remained incomplete after 6 years of intermittent construction, while American yards were completing comparable ships in 14 to 18 months. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. American carrier doctrine also reflected different strategic thinking than European naval traditions emphasized. German naval planning focused on decisive fleet engagements, where individual ship superiority would prove decisive, a doctrine inherited from the Imperial Navy's experience in the First World War. American carrier strategy accepted that individual vessels might be lost, but emphasized force concentration that achieved overwhelming numerical superiority at critical points. The Essex-class carriers were designed for replaceability rather than individual excellence, with standardized layouts that allowed rapid crew training and simplified logistics support. This philosophy extended to aircraft operations. American carriers operated larger air wings than their Japanese counterparts, prioritizing sortie rates over individual aircraft performance. The standardization allowed for streamlined maintenance procedures and simplified parts logistics, enabling sustained operations far from home ports. Japanese carriers, by contrast, emphasized elite pilot training and aircraft quality, producing smaller air wings that achieved tactical excellence, but could not be rapidly replaced after losses. The American approach traded individual capability for systemic resilience, creating naval aviation forces that could absorb losses and continue operations, while Japanese carrier strength diminished irreversibly after each major engagement. Dönitz's strategic reassessment, delivered to Hitler on April 3, 1943, acknowledged American carrier production superiority, while arguing that continued U-boat warfare remained Germany's only viable naval strategy despite mounting challenges. The report emphasized recent submarine successes against Atlantic convoys, noting that March had seen U-boats sink over 100 Allied merchantmen totaling 600,000 tons. These tactical victories, Dönitz argued, demonstrated that aggressive submarine operations could still inflict unacceptable losses on Allied shipping despite improved anti-submarine measures. The reassessment avoided explicit acknowledgement that American industrial capacity made strategic victory unattainable through naval means alone. Such conclusions, however obvious to intelligence analysts, could not be presented to Hitler without inviting accusations of defeatism. Dönitz instead recommended accelerated U-boat construction, development of improved submarine types with enhanced underwater performance, and continued emphasis on wolf-pack tactics that had proven successful during the war's early years. The recommendations represented logical extensions of existing strategy rather than fundamental revision based on the carrier intelligence. Hitler's response reflected his characteristic refusal to accept strategic limitations. The Führer dismissed concerns about American carrier production, arguing that German technological superiority would offset numerical disadvantages through development of advanced weapon systems. He ordered increased resources for experimental programs, including jet aircraft, guided missiles, and improved submarine designs that would restore German tactical advantages. The directives reflected Hitler's preference for technological solutions over the industrial mobilization that might have allowed Germany to compete with American production capacity, had such mobilization begun before the war, rather than after 3 years of consuming accumulated stockpiles. Muller continued tracking American carrier production through 1943 and into 1944, watching as his initial projections proved conservative. By June 1944, 17 Essex-class carriers had commissioned, with 7 more completing trials. American shipyards had achieved production rates exceeding 1 carrier per month, a pace that German intelligence had initially dismissed as propaganda. The vessels were proving highly effective in Pacific operations, with their aircraft destroying Japanese naval aviation at catastrophic rates during engagements in the Philippine Sea and later battles. The intelligence officers' reports documented not merely American quantitative superiority, but qualitative improvements that emerged from operational experience. Early Essex-class vessels had revealed design limitations that peacetime planning could not anticipate, including insufficient anti-aircraft armament and inadequate armor protection for aviation fuel systems. American yards had incorporated modifications into vessels still under construction, implementing changes across the entire production run within months of identifying problems. The responsiveness demonstrated industrial flexibility that German shipbuilding, with its emphasis on frozen designs and formal modification procedures, could not match. By autumn 1944, American carrier forces had effectively destroyed Japanese naval aviation as a strategic threat, achieving the dominance that Muller's analysis had predicted 18 months earlier. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October confirmed that Japanese carrier forces could no longer contest American naval supremacy, with U.S. carriers launching strikes that sank 4 Japanese carriers while sustaining minimal losses. American industrial capacity had produced not merely numerical superiority but overwhelming force concentration that rendered Japanese tactical skill and individual sacrifice strategically irrelevant. The final confirmation of Muller's assessment came in December 1944, when reconnaissance reported that American shipyards had completed 24 Essex-class carriers since the program's beginning, precisely matching the projection that had seemed impossibly optimistic 21 months earlier. Additional vessels remained under construction for deployment in 1945, suggesting that American carrier strength would continue expanding even as Japanese resistance collapsed. The production achievement represented industrial capacity, operating at scales that no previous nation had approached, transforming naval warfare through systematic application of manufacturing methods to complex warship construction. Muller's personal papers, discovered after the war, revealed his understanding that the carrier production data had confirmed Germany's strategic defeat long before military collapse became undeniable. An entry, dated March 19, 1943, the day after briefing Dönitz, noted simply that 24 carriers in 18 months proves mathematics cannot be defeated through courage alone. The observation reflected his recognition that Germany faced an opponent whose industrial base could simultaneously prosecute global war, while expanding production capacity, replacing losses, and developing new weapon systems. No amount of tactical brilliance or operational innovation could overcome such comprehensive material superiority. The winter of 1944 brought darkness to Berlin that extended beyond the shortened days and blackout regulations that governed civilian life under constant aerial bombardment. Muller's intelligence section had relocated twice as Allied bombing intensified, moving from the Tirpitz-Ufer headquarters, to provisional offices in reinforced basement facilities that offered protection from raids that now occurred with numbing regularity. The Corvettin Capitaine, promoted despite his pessimistic assessments, continued tracking American naval construction with the methodical attention that had characterized his work since 1943, documenting a production achievement that had transformed global naval balance irrevocably. By January 1945, American shipyards had commissioned 32 Essex-class carriers with additional vessels completing final outfitting. The production run had exceeded even the ambitious projections that Muller had presented 2 years earlier, demonstrating industrial capacity that continued expanding despite simultaneous demands from ground forces fighting across France and the Philippines. Each new carrier represented not merely another warship, but confirmation that American industrial mobilization had achieved self-sustaining momentum that would continue regardless of tactical setbacks or operational challenges. Mueller's analysis now focused on implications for Germany's endgame rather than ongoing strategic competition. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east, while American and British armies advanced through western Germany, squeezing the Reich between converging offensives that no remaining German forces could contain. The Kriegsmarine had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, with remaining surface units confined to Baltic ports and U-boat operations reduced to isolated attacks that achieved negligible strategic impact. American carriers, whose production had signaled Germany's inevitable defeat, were supporting Pacific operations that would culminate in Japan's surrender, leaving Germany's last ally facing the same overwhelming industrial superiority that had doomed the Third Reich. The intelligence officer's final report on American carrier production, dated March 1, 1945, represented more than statistical compilation. Mueller had spent 2 years documenting how industrial capacity, when systematically mobilized and competently managed, could determine military outcomes regardless of tactical proficiency or operational innovation. Germany had entered the war believing that superior training, advanced technology, and battlefield excellence would offset material disadvantages. The carrier production data had demonstrated that such advantages became meaningless when opponents could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them, while simultaneously expanding offensive capabilities across multiple theaters. The Essex-class program had achieved what no previous naval construction effort had accomplished, producing fleet carriers at rates that transformed them from precious capital ships requiring careful preservation into expendable assets that could be risked aggressively because replacements were already under construction. This shift in strategic thinking reflected American industrial confidence that German planners, even after witnessing production achievements, struggled to fully comprehend. The United States had built a navy so large that individual ship losses became statistically insignificant, creating force structures that could absorb tactical defeats while maintaining strategic momentum through sheer numerical superiority. Mueller understood that his intelligence work had identified Germany's strategic predicament accurately, but far too late to influence outcomes. The carrier production data from March 1943 had confirmed what should have been obvious to German leadership by late 1941, that America's industrial mobilization would eventually produce military forces that no combination of German tactical skill and technological innovation could defeat. The recognition had come after Germany had committed to strategies that assumed American production limitations would prevent decisive material superiority from developing before U-boat warfare, and territorial conquest had secured German victory. The mathematical inevitability that Mueller had recognized in those reconnaissance photographs had proven immune to wishful thinking or ideological conviction. 24 fleet carriers in 18 months represented industrial output that exceeded Germany's capacity to counter through any available means. The vessels themselves were competent rather than exceptional. incorporating design compromises that German naval architects would have rejected as unacceptable. Their decisive advantage lay not in individual superiority, but in numbers that allowed American forces to achieve overwhelming concentration at critical points, while maintaining reserves that could absorb losses and continue operations. Japanese naval officers, interrogated after their nation's surrender in August 1945, confirmed what Mueller's analysis had predicted. American carrier forces had achieved such numerical superiority by mid-1944 that Japanese defensive strategy had collapsed under sustained pressure that could be maintained indefinitely. The battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf had not merely defeated Japanese naval aviation, but had destroyed it so completely that reconstruction became impossible. American carriers had operated in formations of 12 to 16 vessels, concentrating air power that could overwhelm any defensive position while accepting losses that would have been catastrophic to forces that could not rapidly replace damaged ships and depleted air wings. The industrial achievement that the Essex-class program represented extended beyond the carriers themselves to encompass entire logistics networks that sustained operations across Pacific distances. American fleet trains, composed of tankers, ammunition ships, repair vessels, and supply transports, allowed carrier task forces to remain at sea for months, conducting sustained operations far from home ports. This capability reflected systematic planning that had anticipated wartime requirements and had mobilized industrial capacity to meet them through standardized equipment, interchangeable components, and training programs that produced crews faster than ships could be completed. Germany had never achieved comparable industrial mobilization, despite possessing sophisticated manufacturing capabilities and skilled labor forces. The Reich's economy had remained partially mobilized until 1943, with consumer goods production continuing at levels that diverted resources from war production. When full mobilization finally occurred, Allied bombing had already begun degrading industrial infrastructure, while raw material shortages limited production regardless of available manufacturing capacity. The result was an economy that consumed accumulated stockpiles, while failing to replace losses at rates necessary for sustained operations against opponents whose industrial bases remained largely immune to German attack. Miller's intelligence work had documented this disparity with depressing clarity. American steel production in 1944 exceeded 100 million tons, with naval construction consuming a fraction of output, while maintaining shipbuilding programs that dwarfed Germany's entire industrial capacity. American aluminum production supported aircraft manufacturing that delivered thousands of planes monthly to forces operating on multiple continents. American automotive production, converted to military vehicles, provided trucks and transporters that gave Allied ground forces mobility that German armies, increasingly dependent on horse-drawn transport, could not match. The carrier production represented the most visible manifestation of industrial superiority that pervaded every aspect of military competition. For each Essex-class carrier completed, American yards had also produced dozens of escort carriers, hundreds of destroyers and destroyer escorts, thousands of landing craft, and tens of thousands of merchant vessels that replaced losses from U-boat warfare while expanding the shipping capacity available for supplying overseas forces. The production achievement was comprehensive rather than specialized, reflecting industrial mobilization that transformed America's peacetime economy into war production that exceeded the combined output of all Axis powers. The psychological impact on German naval officers who understood these statistics manifested in various ways. Some embraced technological fantasies, believing that jet aircraft, guided missiles, or improved U-boats would restore tactical balance despite overwhelming material disadvantages. Others retreated into professional competence, executing assigned duties with precision while avoiding contemplation of strategic futility. Mueller chose documentary thoroughness, compiling intelligence assessments that would provide historical record of how Germany's naval leadership had recognized but failed to effectively counter American industrial superiority. His final entries, written as Soviet artillery, began shelling Berlin's government district, reflected on lessons that Germany's defeat offered for future conflicts. Industrial capacity, when fully mobilized and protected from enemy attack, could determine war outcomes regardless of tactical proficiency or technological advantages. Quality could not substitute for quantity when numerical disparities reached levels that allowed opponents to achieve overwhelming force concentration while maintaining strategic reserves. Most significantly, wars could not be won through military means alone when opponents possessed industrial bases capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted, while simultaneously expanding offensive capabilities. The Essex-class carriers had proven all these principles with brutal clarity. American shipyards had completed the vessels in timelines that German intelligence had initially dismissed as impossible, then had exceeded production targets that revised estimates had established. The carriers had operated with effectiveness that validated American design philosophy, prioritizing adequate performance and rapid production over German emphasis on individual ship excellence. Most decisively, the carriers had achieved such numerical superiority that tactical skill became irrelevant against forces that could absorb losses, replace damaged vessels, and maintain operational tempo indefinitely. Mueller survived the war's end, surrendering to British forces in May 1945 and spending 2 years in prisoner-of-war camps before repatriation to occupied Germany. His intelligence files, captured intact when Soviet forces overran Kriegsmarine headquarters, provided Allied analysts with detailed documentation of how German naval leadership had tracked but failed to counter American carrier production. Post-war interrogations revealed that Mueller had recognized the strategic implications of Essex-class construction rates by April 1943-18. Months before Germany's military situation became obviously hopeless, but had been unable to influence strategic decisions that Hitler's ideological convictions and Dönitz's commitment to U-boat warfare had already determined. The carrier production data had confirmed rather than created Germany's strategic predicament. American industrial mobilization had been underway since 1940, proceeding with systematic thoroughness that reflected planning begun before Pearl Harbor forced American entry into the war. The Essex-class program represented one component of comprehensive naval expansion that included battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliary vessels produced in quantities that transformed the United States from a two-ocean navy operating obsolescent vessels into the world's dominant naval power within 4 years. British naval historians, analyzing captured German intelligence after the war, noted that Mueller's reports had accurately identified American production capabilities, but had reached leadership too committed to existing strategies to implement fundamental changes. Dönitz had continued emphasizing U-boat construction through 1944, despite mounting evidence that submarine warfare could not achieve decisive results against opponents who replaced merchantmen faster than U-boats could sink them. Hitler had rejected strategic reassessment, preferring technological optimism and ideological conviction over material analysis that suggested Germany faced insurmountable disadvantages. The Essex-class carriers themselves continued serving through the Cold War, with many vessels receiving extensive modifications that extended operational lives into the 1970s. Their longevity reflected robust construction that had prioritized reliability and maintainability alongside rapid production. American shipyards had proven that mass production methods could produce warships of lasting value rather than disposable assets, validating design philosophy that German naval architects had initially dismissed as sacrificing quality for speed. The final irony of Müller's intelligence work lay in its ultimate irrelevance to strategic outcomes. His analysis had correctly identified American industrial superiority and had accurately projected its implications for naval competition. The recognition had prompted no effective German response because no response was possible given the Reich's deteriorating strategic position and limited remaining resources. Germany had entered the war unprepared for sustained industrial competition against opponents whose production capacity exceeded Axis powers combined, and no amount of tactical brilliance could offset this fundamental disadvantage once American mobilization reached full capacity. The 24 Essex-class carriers completed in 18 months had represented merely the most visible evidence of industrial superiority that pervaded every aspect of military competition. Behind those carriers stood shipyards that had expanded capacity by factors of 10, manufacturing plants that produced components in quantities that German industry could not approach, logistics networks that sustained operations across oceanic distances, and training programs that generated crews faster than vessels could be completed. The entire system reflected industrial mobilization that transformed American society's productive capacity into military power, that no combination of German tactical skill and technological innovation could defeat. Müller's recognition that the war was lost formed while examining reconnaissance photographs in March 1943, had proven accurate 26 months before Germany's formal surrender. The carrier production data had confirmed mathematical inevitability that ideology could not overcome and courage could not defeat. American industrial capacity, systematically mobilized and competently applied to warship construction, had produced naval forces that rendered German naval resistance strategically futile, regardless of tactical outcomes in individual engagements. The intelligence officer spent his remaining years in post-war Germany working as a technical translator and avoiding public discussion of his wartime service. His captured files provided historians with detailed documentation of how German naval intelligence had tracked American carrier production, recognized its strategic implications, and watched helplessly as predictions of inevitable defeat materialized with mathematical precision. The Essex-class program had demonstrated that modern warfare's outcomes would be determined by industrial capacity rather than martial valor, a lesson that would influence military planning throughout the Cold War and beyond. The photographs that had first revealed the scope of American carrier production remained in Müller's personal papers until his death in 1978. 7 carriers under construction simultaneously at facilities that would eventually complete 32 vessels in less than 4 years. The images represented evidence that had confirmed Germany's strategic defeat 2 years before military collapse became undeniable to the Reich's leadership. 24 carriers in 18 months had proven that wars between industrial powers would be won not on battlefields but in factories, shipyards, and logistics networks that sustained military forces across global theaters. The mathematical certainty that Müller had recognized in those reconnaissance photographs had rendered all subsequent German naval operations exercises in futility rather than meaningful strategic competition. American industrial superiority had produced forces so overwhelming that tactical excellence became irrelevant against opponents who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them while expanding offensive capabilities that would eventually destroy the Third Reich completely. The carrier production had represented not merely naval construction, but comprehensive industrial mobilization that determined the Second World War's outcome as surely as any battle fought on land or sea. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.